Well, I think we should start. Any objections? We have a lot to do in 90 minutes.
Sounds good.
Senator Simmons' staff will be joining during the 90 minutes, as he may as well. This third discourse meeting is focused on financing scenarios. The agenda for the 90 minutes is to review the goals, be prepared to ask key questions after the presentation of scenarios, and make comments and other kinds of discussion. So I'm just going off video because my internet's unstable. Hopefully people can hear me.
Yes.
Yes.
We can.
Oh, good. Thank you. The goal of the task force is to examine housing cooperatives as an option to address the affordable housing shortage, which, as you know, is over 180,000 affordable units or homes. The objectives given to us are to identify developers and sponsors interested in housing co-op development, to review existing funding systems, to see how they apply, and to recommend new programs and systems to Senator Simmons and to Ida. And Linda's going to talk about some fundamental concepts.
Okay. Well, good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Mhm.
Good morning.
For today's conversation and discussion, I want to kind of set the framework for looking at some of these models. So there was some um, and for the discussion moving forward. So just looking at some fundamental concepts around this issue. The first is really that co-ops, in my mind, co-ops are kind of a hybrid model because they have characteristics that you see with people who are doing multifamily rental development as well as also home ownership components. And so in funding these, there are typically very straight lines between funding for multifamily rental and funding for home ownership. And cooperatives basically kind of can incorporate both of those tracks. So that makes it a little different, makes it a little nuanced. That's basically what I should say. It just makes it a little nuanced in how we look at these deals. The next is that when I look at putting together financing models, and we'll go through a few today. For me, it starts with the target market that we're trying to serve. So basically who are we trying to serve? And we're really looking at income levels. Then we're also looking at other kind of housing characteristics. When you look at unit size, things like that, that's kind of for me when I do these kinds of analysis and scenarios and really begin to work with folks on this. That's kind of where I start. As far as debt on these projects, um, debt can be secured at a couple of different levels when you're dealing in housing co-ops. The first level of debt for the association can be a blanket mortgage on that particular property. But then the second level of debt is really on the can be on the cooperative members. If they're on share prices that are high enough that people need to get share loans on, then that becomes a second level of debt. However, even with that second level of debt for a share loan, in my mind, the way I structure these deals typically is that the amount of money that people have to pay for their monthly carrying charges, which includes the debt for that blanket mortgage on the building, plus their share loan that basically should be structured so that people aren't cost burdened. So based upon that target market that you're willing to that you're looking to serve, then the combination of those two should be affordable to that market without folks becoming cost burdened. And then lastly, in funding the gaps, because on these, when you're trying to get a certain target market, then there's some form of a gap, then that needs to be addressed by utilizing subsidies that you typically see on multifamily rental projects, as well as those that you can see on the homeownership end. So we need to talk about how and really begin to try to think about how we can utilize existing products to do this, as well as develop some new funding sources as well. So those are the fundamental concepts. Rachel, you want me to keep going or you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go through these quick, give you a second to rest. So as Linda's going to present a handful of different ways to fund a co-op, these are the questions we're going to come back to. What public and private sources can be used to cover the gap in each scenario and still serve the target market? What blanket mortgage products are available? What incentives, policy changes, etc., should be implemented to broaden access to share loans? Are there barriers to securing share loans for purchasers between 60 and 80% of AMI? And we're asking a question about that kind of missing middle household that we know there is a large demand of people for housing that's affordable and stable in that income range in Chicago. Other barriers that you might think of to secure blanket financing. And the last question is, what other changes are required to normalize housing co-ops within public and private entities? Okay, Linda, I stopped sharing, so
All right. So let me share my screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
No? Yes, no? Okay. So what I did, and not going to spend a ton of time on this because I really want to make sure that we have the discussion, but what I did was create just about four preliminary models around housing cooperatives and about four scenarios. And so the four scenarios we're looking at, the four include acquisition only. And in that, when we talk about acquisition only, this could be a situation where residents of a rental building, the owner wants to sell, they have the right of first refusal, they want to come in and organize a housing cooperative. That could be an acquisition only strategy. The second is acquisition with moderate rehab. Um, Basically, this could be a condominium that is deconverting. It could be a receivership property that has been purchased through forfeiture for private investors that may require some rehab. So that can be another way of developing or creating, a housing co-op. The third is acquisition. So the first to assume that these are occupied properties. The last two scenarios assuming that you're dealing with vacant property. And so the next one is acquisition that requires substantial rehab, and that's a vacant property acquired probably through foreclosure, maybe through receivership, maybe through probate, but it is clearly vacant and requires substantial or gut rehab. And then the last is looking at creating a co-op just with using new construction. So it's basically you're building on vacant land and you are creating this co-op from there. So what we did was to take in these four scenarios, we really looked at kind of some actual properties and actual developments that are going on that are or properties that are available or development that is proposed for some other kind of strategy, whether it's creating condominiums, whether it's creating rental housing, and just try to see what this would look like if we develop these as housing cooperatives. So the first one is an acquisition only strategy. This is looking at an existing, there is this 23 unit building that is on the market down in Grand Boulevard. It has a pretty good unit mix of 2, 3, and 4 bedroom units. Again, in all of these scenarios, we are focused on this target market of folks between 60 and 80%. And the reason we're looking at that market is that that is typically the market that basically their incomes are too high to qualify for like the tax credit deals and all. And then it is too low to sometimes it is too low to basically sustain home ownership, single family home ownership. And these are folks that, that work every day and just are in this little spot. Their rent, half the time they're cost burden because they are paying rent that is too high, but they just aren't quite to the level yet of being able to necessarily purchase a single family home, especially at prices in this area. So that's the group that you are utilizing and looking at to target. Because as I say, that's what I start with, the target, my initial assessment is about the target market. So under this scenario, you can see that this property has an asking price right now of about $4,400,000, and the property is in, it's occupied, it's in pretty good shape. So that's about $191,000 per unit. Just to acquire it, you may have fees. I think I did fees at maybe 2% or something like that on this property to just acquire it, to pay at whatever cost. So here the sources of funds could be a first mortgage of about 1.8 million. And then I looked at, is that right? Yeah. I looked at 10% equity, and that 10% equity in this deal would be filled, through a share loan structure. Even with that, there is still a gap on this of about $2.5 million. And again, that's because of the income that is being targeted. So as we go on this discussion, we can talk further after I go through the scenarios about how we go about filling that particular gap. As we move down, we're looking at the operating and what this will generate. One thing I want to say about operating scenarios is that I am assuming, I'm making an assumption on a couple of things because I'm targeting people between 60 and 80%. In looking at the market analysis and the competition for housing units, I really looked at what the fair market rent would look like within that HUD or whatever has established in the area, because typically that fair market rent falls somewhere between what's affordable for folks between 60 and 80%. And so I'm trying to structure the monthly carrying charges plus the assessments that they basically do not exceed that amount so that people are not necessarily cost burdened. So in looking at that scenario, based upon that and using that as a guide, I'm looking at gross income from just the monthly carrying charges, how much it would generate for these 23 units. If I scroll down, I am saying that the monthly carrying charges on the 2-bedroom would be about $1,316, on the 3 bedrooms about $1,661, and on a 4-bedroom about $1,983. And when you combine that with what the share price is, on this, we were looking at an average share price somewhere around, on a per unit basis, it's just a little bit around, averaging around $20,000. When you add those two in, then you're looking at these total housing costs that will not exceed what fair market rent is, that has been established, by HUD. Again, this is just an overall fair market rent. What you would do is, really look at it community by community. So by zip code is basically, by zip code if you're looking at those smaller areas, how they determine fair market rent. So that's just an acquisition only strategy. It does have about a $2 million gap. We can discuss how, as a part of our discussion, how that might be filled for this. Just moving to the next model. This is acquisition and moderate rehab. Here we're looking at a building. This is a real property. We are not identifying any of the properties to protect, um, uh, to have privacy and all about these properties. But this is a real 40-unit building that is actually kind of I think it's in receivership right now. And there's a possibility of doing a deconversion on it. It's a condo. It's currently a condominium. Right now, we think the acquisition cost on this would be about 4 million, which I want to highlight that because this is in Washington Park that doesn't have, as high a value necessarily as Grand Boulevard, but you can see the difference in the acquisition price. That is lower, is for a substantial amount more units than in the Grand Boulevard example, but you can see that the acquisition cost and the value, the estimated value of it is substantially lower. Instead of it being closer to $200,000 per unit, we're talking about $100,000 a unit. They feel that there's construction on common areas that would be needed somewhere around $800,000. You put in the soft cost. I always put this is rehab. I put a 10% contingency in, 20% of soft cost, and another 10% of total fees. Then we're looking at total development cost of about 5.6 million. That's what we're looking at here. And that's about $139,000 per unit. So as looking at the sources, again, we're looking at a first mortgage of about 2.2 million. We think that's what we could get. The share price, again, will be at that 10%. And so this one also has a gap of about 2.7. And it's the same kind of scenario, looking at the operating income. The share pricing here would be about 13,000 to 15,000, which means you would leave, there's a little bit more money that can be that you can use to support a higher, this higher amount of a blanket mortgage. And again, between those two pieces, again, the total monthly housing costs still do not exceed that fair market rent level. So you can see those are about 2.2. However, so let's move to the next one when we're dealing with vacant buildings, because this is where the gap gets really big. So on the next one, which is this acquisition and substantial rehab, this is an existing 30-unit building that is in the market, on the market right now. We are seeing big portfolios of properties that, are owned by private investors that are being put on the market now, basically just looking for buyers. So this is actually on the market right now for 1.2 million and it's vacant. 30 units, that's about $40,000 per unit. This is in Greater Grand Crossing. This will require substantial rehabilitation to get it, into a state where it can be occupied. So I usually base this on a percentage of a new construction number. This is a gut rehab right now to do new construction in the city of Chicago. Those prices are varying, anywhere from probably $275 to $375 a square foot, or more than that. We may be even seeing higher prices than that. And I usually take about 75% of that new construction number to try to estimate what substantial rehab might be on these. So in looking at this, you can see where the numbers are. The total development costs are almost $12.5 million, and that's about $400,000 per unit. And however, you can see there's a substantial difference when you look at the sources. So here to do 10%, this means the share loans would be are averaging somewhere around $40,000. And because again, we are targeting a certain income level, then the amount that we're going to be able to if people have to get a share loan plus the amount of money it takes to operate this property, that is going to reduce any amount of dollars that you can use to service debt. So as you can see, the debt service is very, very low in this particular scenario. It's saying that the first mortgage on this property would only be about $860 some odd thousand dollars. So there's a huge gap on this of about 10.4 million. And even if this property was being done, as a rental, even if you're still targeting this, you are still going to have these huge gaps that need to be filled on these properties. So on a live tech deal, that a substantial portion of that gap would be filled by tax credit equity. Because this is a co-op, there will be, we will have to figure out the sources to fill that particular gap. Again, just moving down, this just gives you the operating budget that shows you how you get, what you can support in that first mortgage. Again, here the share loan, because it is higher, there'll be a higher monthly payment associated with that. When you add that to the covering that monthly debt coverage, that monthly carrying charge, then basically you are still at this fair market rent. The same thing with new construction is no different. The gap is this is looking at a 24 unit new construction development that's proposed for South Chicago. These are like 6 flats, four sets of 6 flats that are being developed, probably as condominiums. And looking at this as a co-op, again, you're still at this new construction. You save on the land cost. You can probably get the land for even less than that. But you're still at about a $12.7 million development where you have about a $10.8 million gap. So you're at about $530,000 per unit. And of course, we are even seeing some costs higher than that on new construction at this point. So again, here share pricing would range anywhere between $48,000 about $57,000 per unit. You still have the same level of monthly carrying charges, but again, that combination, you would need that level of subsidy to make sure that you are able to serve those residents and allow those residents to live in this, but not be cost burdened by paying more than that fair market rent. So these are just the 4 scenarios we wanted to go through. So, and try to take a look at what these might look like if they were developed as housing cooperatives. So at this point, I think we can open this up for questions and kind of begin to go back through some of those questions that we wanted to have you all weigh in on for today.
Linda, this is really impressive work. It's really, really helpful to have real scenarios. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I'm glad we got to this point because this feels really important. One thought, just based on experience elsewhere, is if there's a scenario sort of in between the second and third of an occupied building that has substantial rehab, because that's something I think we'll definitely encounter. And then you have to factor in relocation costs, which can be substantial as well. But obviously, you can't cover every single scenario in 4 models, but just flagging that as a likely potential situation that we'll have to think through. But for now, I guess we can just use the third scenario as sort of a proxy for that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Significant gap. Yeah. Okay. No, I don't. I want to get to the conversation about ideas for gap sources, both on the development side and the operating side. So yeah, I don't have any other questions or comments. That's just one thought that comes to mind. Thank you for doing this. This is super helpful.
David, I think you're next with a question.
Linda, just echoing what Peter and James shared. This is wonderful to see. And this is both a question and maybe the source of discussion for later. I know we noticed that the unit count for the scenarios is 20 and above. I didn't know if you have any thoughts on smaller co-ops, if, you know, the 6 to 10 or 10 to 20 range. And I know, Rachel, we've talked about this a bit, but I thought it might be helpful just to share the thinking on the unit count. And if you see a minimum threshold that makes this viable.
Well, I looked at properties between 20 and 40 units. And I guess, yeah, this is probably just based upon this probably is just based upon my development experience. It seems that when you have units of that size, though of the units I have developed, units of that size have usually been pretty successful in sustaining themselves over time, because you have units of that size and even a little larger have an ability to sustain themselves because, again, these are co-ops, these are shareholders, who basically also have to, you're basically managing this building, you're participating in boards and committees and all. And so when you have a building of a substantial size, you don't burn people out, over time, people come in and all. And so a lot of it is just about that. It's about being sustainable. So I guess that's just probably just my personal bias. That does not mean that's right or wrong. It's just, I've just seen these work pretty well when they're within this space or even larger. I'm in a 60 unit co-op and I've been in a 60 unit co-op for over 30 years. And I think that's part of the size. Our size has enabled us to be sustainable over time just because people come and go out of decision-making roles, but you just don't burn people out at, that level or larger. So that's just probably my personal bias. So yeah.
But there's no prohibition. I mean, we've seen a 2-unit co-op.
Yeah.
We know the largest co-op is Co-op City in New York, right, which is over 50,000 units. So as leaders, all of us want to make sure, of course, and we'll talk about sustainability at the last meeting, but there's no cost burden, the building can be kept up, and that leadership is, well, like Linda said, is sustainable. Those are key issues. Yeah. So I think Peter, you're next. And then Itai.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
I guess one of the things this illustrates, which is something we've been seeing around the country, is it's a whole lot easier to do a conversion monetarily than a new construction or the equivalent.
Yeah.
And that's useful, in sort of, people imagining this beautiful brand new building that never existed, especially with interest rates and construction inflation. It's just becoming, as you're illustrating, incredibly expensive. And same true for rental.
Yeah.
This And I think the question or comment that someone made, I think James made in the chat, what's the difference of this from rental? And the big difference is the share loans are going to be more burdensome, because they're typically shorter term, perhaps higher interest rate, even if they're the same interest rate, if it's a 10 or 15-year amortization instead of a 30 or 40-year, that's a huge difference. And that's something to, we can look at in a particular project, but that's, but you're, as you point out, you're getting the benefit of a home ownership project instead of a rental project. And so for policy, these numbers, are certainly seem attractive on a policy standpoint of the conversion of an existing building. And I think something you're not getting at yet is the other piece of this is preservation of the existing co-ops, which the numbers, of course, are similar, and that's really the lowest hanging fruit is preserving those co-ops. And the other thing I was going to throw in is the climate money, is something that can really cover a lot of the rehab costs. So your scenarios with fairly low rehab costs may well be realistic and may be even, achieve somewhat lower if the things we're looking at are things that are climate related, which windows, heating systems, and the like are often the most expensive thing that you need to do to improve an existing building. So that and Biden administration has been very explicit that they want to see the climate money used to expand affordable housing. So that's it for me.
Thanks, Peter. Utai?
Yeah, thank you, Linda. This is very helpful. I'm wondering what the scenario would be like for dealing with people who are making under 60% of median. That's where the most need is, as we know, and the gap gets greater when you're looking at populations under 50%, 40% of median. And this form of housing obviously would be most helpful to that group of people. So I'm just wondering why we picked 60 to 80, because we don't want to assume that populations under that income level are not suitable for co-op housing. I'm sure that's not the assumption being made, but I think we should really highlight that that is a population where we might have the most impact with co-op housing. Thank you.
So again, Itai, I just picked the 60. I picked the 60 to 80 just because, like I said, those folks don't qualify, for, most of the affordable housing that's done with tax credits and all, their incomes are too high. And then they also have difficulty sustaining home ownership because their incomes are too low to do that. So they just are kind of, they're just there. And so they just don't have necessarily a lot of housing options. That's the only reason I picked that.
Yeah, I know. I understand. Yeah, they don't qualify for tax credits, but as you know, neither do people who are making under 40% of median in most cases. So I think that's where the most need is, and I think that is where most of our energy should really focus, so that it doesn't seem like we're disregarding that population.
Yeah.
So just wanted to make this point.
Did she get off? Okay.
Thanks,
All right.
Yatai. Go ahead, Linda.
Yeah, no. So I guess just to get at some of these questions, I don't know if is Rachel still on? I can't see.
Looks
who's
like she
on.
dropped.
She dropped her. Oh, that's what's happening. Okay. So, couple of things. So we have these gaps, and again, the gaps on occupied and the acquisition only, the conversion type of stuff. Yeah, those are much less. But in looking at even the ones with the larger gaps and all, I guess in going back to some of these key questions, what kind of thoughts do people have on based upon the current, you talked about the energy money. Are there other sources and all that? We believe existing sources that are out there that can be targeted to fill these gaps, whether it's, the smaller ones versus the larger ones, and still serve, the target markets that we're looking at. So, what are folks' thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Kristen.
Well, I think we should definitely take a look at the city's shared equity investment program. I can't remember. I'm in a lot of overlap with my different meetings. But for anyone who doesn't know, that's a program the contracts are in the process of being awarded for the administrators. And there is subsidy up to $100,000 per unit for developers, for the or for 2 co-ops for the acquisition and creation of co-ops. And then there's up to $60,000 per unit to subsidize for purchase assistance to help individuals afford individual shares. And it will be available to people of less than 120%. Well, right now, I don't know that it's been a final decision. For sure, less than 140%, but somewhere between 120 and 140% AMI. And that is significant. I would love to see us, and that money is going to be available, by this summer, hopefully. And so I would love to see us look at some scenarios because like in your examples, Linda, you don't have, I don't think anywhere in your examples, you had shares of more than 60,000.
Mm-hmm.
And we're talking about subsidy purchase assistance of up to 60,000. So I think that is, I think that's significant and we should definitely look at those, add that in.
Okay. Other thoughts?
It's Andy. I would agree with that statement. I mean, we've seen in both in New York and in other jurisdictions, both where there are, state grants or state first-time homebuyer grants, that it's been a significant for us in New York. It's been significant for filling the gaps. We have programs that provide up to 40,000 a unit for first-time home buyers. And it means that both, people, and so we can have slightly higher purchase prices, and those home buyer grants would apply to within 10 years before they wear off. They can be reapplied to next owners, so they carry on into the future. The other piece that's been very important to us, and we've used in other cities in New Haven, and so with this Section 8, being able to provide vouchers allows you to reach lower income folks, but Section 8 vouchers can be used up to 80% of median for homeownership. And so that also allows you to increase the income of the project, even and have a broader number of people. And in some cases, whoever controls the Section 8 can just say that they would allocate vouchers that can be used in projects which we see in New York City because city has some of its own allocation or the state. But also public housing authorities have some vouchers that they can project base. And so they could make those available to a particular project, which is even in many ways nicer because they stay with the project and not just the individual. The other program, which I'm not sure where it is in the federal budget, that also, like Section 8, can go up to 80%, and we've used to fill these gaps, is the home program. But it goes to a higher income level when you are doing home ownership. And so at times in the past, we've used home funds to fill this kind of gap. And so it's, each one of these additions makes the project ever more complex and complicated. But on the other hand, in the end, you can fill up the gaps and get a stack that actually makes the project affordable.
I do have one question on based upon Kristen, what you said, as well as Andy, what you're saying is what we have these home buyer assistance and purchase assistance programs and all that are in existence. So what has been the barrier, or why have these never been applied, or what's holding it back from being applied to cooperative housing here? What is the issue?
Well, the
What do
shared
we need to
equity
put forward?
investment program is new, right? Like that was just, that hasn't even launched. So that was the RFP that the city put out, I think in like March. And they just are like making awards. So it's I think, David, $3.5 million, right, investment. So 2 million in subsidy for acquisition, 1.5 million for purchase assistance. So that's that's new, right? That's part of like a new effort with the city. As far as other purchase assistance, like, other existing down payment assistance programs, I'm not sure, if we've tried. I don't have enough experience to know if they've been tried with co-ops. For example, the city has had MMRP or I don't know, I'm trying to think of other like city or, IDA has down payment assistance programs. I don't know if they've been used with co-op housing.
And
The
I guess my
rules may be
question, go
written
ahead.
so that that make it unclear or preclude it, but it's certainly there's no, Linda, I think your wonder is sort of, why not? Because that can be a much bigger pot.
Yeah, I think that is a question, right?
Yeah, it is, because I just don't quite. So, when you look at HUD programs, some HUD programs and all, it's very clear. They're like, you can use this for rental housing, use this for housing co-ops or whatever. It's just out there. But you don't see that anywhere else. So how do we normalize this financing? I guess that's part of it. How do we make this just as normal? If you come in with a rental project, if you come in with a co-op, this should be normal. It should be underwritten in that. So that's what I'm trying to get at. What needs to happen?
I totally agree. And I think one of the things we're kind of working through with the city right now is, for example, with co-ops and the purchase assistance, like what that form of agreement is going to look like, right? Like, so I have a lot of experience with what a subsidy, a purchase assistance agreement looks like for a traditional home buyer, right? You either record it, it can be a second mortgage, a soft second lien against the property. It's recorded at the time of closing. So we're kind of working through those details right now, like what the purchase, like form of agreement, legal document is going to look like for co-ops. I think this will be really informative. I think, because it can then help us understand, if other tweaks or changes would need to be made to existing down payment purchase assistance programs.
I think the one other place, which is well, I guess it can be a fairly powerful one, is using FHA financing or refinancing. That's something that we've begun using both in the city and certainly in the projects in other cities around the country. FHA, well, before the interest rates went up, FHA had wonderful interest rates down in the 2% range, and their term can be as long as 45 years. So when you sort of put those things together, they're always slightly below the market, but now they're in the 5 and 6% range, along with everything else. So they're not quite effective, but they are, because they're government guaranteed mortgages, there are investors out there who will buy them, and sometimes they will buy them at better terms than the sort of the regular market has. Or there are ways in which they can move some of the costs and offer a lower interest rate in a longer term by moving some of the costs to a higher cost during the construction period, and so forth. And pension funds like to invest in them and other sorts of things. So there are some ways to make those work. And we had a project that wasn't working in Seattle. It had a gap. And by doing that, it was able to fill $1 million gap, but it was a very big project. The gap wasn't that huge. So, but it was good. And it works for a long time, and it's a government guaranteed mortgage. So there isn't, if things happen out there in the future, it's not as much of a impact on co-ops in general, as it might be in a, local bank foreclosure or something. So, that's one other thing. And there is both the 213 program, which allows you to both do the construction and the permanent mortgage. And there is a refinance program, 223F, which has a slightly lower interest rate, which comes in after the co-op is ready and after it's been financed and created, and it can refinance financing. So you can create it and establish the co-op and have it operating, and then refinance it for the long term at a ever slightly lower interest rate than even the 213 program.
I am not monitoring
Can
the
I
chat, so
follow up
there
on,
may be questions in there. Go ahead.
I'll just follow up, Andy, with your comment, with the HUD programs. Are there different accessibilities based on the region of the country and or who's being served?
No, there's no accessibility. This is sort of the problem you're asking. Why are co-ops so excluded? It has been so unused in the past years that it's all operated out of the Minneapolis office. They're the only ones. So HUD, no matter what part of the country you're in, you end up at the Minneapolis office. And, they know what they know. And so it's a little harder if you're from different regions for them to become, knowledgeable about it. But the program has, there used to be problems with how much per unit and so forth. Most of those things have been resolved. So the program is useful at across a whole range of costs and so forth. But you do go through the Minneapolis office. We use just one lender because they're the most knowledgeable and have done most of them, and that's Centennial Mortgage. And Hugh Jeffers, who's part of the National Association of Housing Co-ops, is the lender. So you're really down to one. There are a few other people who do FHA lending, but most of them do on the rental side and aren't familiar with the co-op side, but there may be others. So, but that's how we've been doing it. In the interim, from when they built, hundreds of thousands of units with these programs, that's just what they used to build large number of the affordable co-ops across the country, is that they've been using them for senior co-ops throughout the upper Midwest. And so those have been ongoing, and that's why it ends up in the Minneapolis office, because Minnesota and some of the other up Wisconsin, other states have had fairly robust senior co-op programs, which are not necessarily affordable, although they can be limited equity, but they're aimed at people who are selling a house and moving into a co-op, and this is how they build them. So people who come with the equity in their house and move in. So, but they then are limited equity on beyond that. So.
And James, I saw your comment in the chat. Thanks for putting that in there. I think we all know that IDA has been very intentional about the amount of research that it's doing to position itself to support cooperatives. So I don't want to put anybody on the spot. Cammie's unfortunately not on the call today. And I see Harris. So I don't know if IDA wants to continue to educate us on this meeting about where they are in terms of their support of cooperatives. But I think we can certainly count on them being a player in the state of Illinois going forward.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I guess I'm just wondering, you know, because again, my caveat, I haven't done as much work in Illinois, but I'm really eager to learn more. If I'm an affordable rental developer in Illinois and I'm looking for my gap funding, I mean, even if it's a tax credit deal, you still need your whatever it is, 100, 200,000 per unit in gap funding from another source beyond your first mortgage. What are people accessing? Do people know, like, what is the program that works best as a gap source from IDA right now? Is there one, or do they only provide interest-bearing debt? Or
I think
someone just popped on the call that can answer it.
I think I've been called.
There you are, Cammie. Sorry about that.
Going from one meeting to the next. I'm sorry. I missed the question, obviously. So
You were literally just summoned, I think.
I know.
Coincidentally. I was just asking, so just to catch you up, we've been talking about looking at different scenarios of co-op development, from AC rehab to new construction to substantial rehab. In each case, different amounts of gap is necessary to fill. Sometimes a small amount, sometimes a more substantial amount. And we're basically just brainstorming about how to fill those gaps, given that a lot of existing resources don't account for the co-op model and aren't really designed to work for it. And I was posing the question for existing IDA programs, what is currently being offered that serves that role in rental housing that could potentially be tweaked to work in more harmony with the co-op model?
So we aren't in the habit of receiving a lot of applications for co-op funding. And so we are in a position now to receive applications for funding, or we will be shortly, to understand what the needs are, but we don't have a regular steady source of this type of activity being requested from us. So we're figuring this out as we go. But on the multifamily side, obviously we have the low-income housing tax credit, which brings in which develops a lot of housing. But then we also have the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, which is a gap financing filler, and for 80% and lower occupants, AMI occupants. So there's no one answer, but out of this task force, it's my understanding that some models will be developed and then presented to the authority to respond to, and in that response, it would address whatever the capital needs are. But we don't have like a product that we're actively like, here's a loan product that we can offer for that. We aren't currently in that space, but whatever comes out of this group and the recommendations as to how to make the advancement of cooperative housing models a real thing, we want to hear from you, and we want to understand what those models are to see if we can meet those needs.
Cammie, if a housing co-op came with, essentially an identical ask to a rental project, are there any impediments regulatorily to Ida, lending to a co-op, or it's really just sort of figuring out how to work it administratively?
It's figuring out how to work it administratively. We had a possible um administrative issue on the share loan lending side, and we've addressed that by changing our rules. It's a whole long process, but anyways, we've added and made sure that cooperative housing share lending is something that we could do if we enter that space in the future. But in terms of lending to a co-op for the rehab or the conversion, that is something that we in theory could do. It's not a prohibited activity for us.
And
The only thing I would say, this is King, the only thing, Cammie, I would say is what you say is correct, but what is the funding source going to be? I don't see it coming from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. We've got higher priority needs to fill there in a number of areas. I just thinking of the rules of home funding or National Low Income Housing Trust Fund, all these other federal programs, I don't think really allow us to do that currently. Unless we got a state grant, like we got money from the state with the major, $30 billion state program for infrastructure and whatnot. We got some of that money, but outside of special state money, I don't see where the money would come from.
Well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's always an issue of prioritization and what project has the higher priority need. It's always a balancing game or an evaluation. But I don't think we've looked into home dollars as an option for this type of activity. But yeah, you're right. I mean, well, the way I was thinking about it, King, is that these projects would have to just come up against the other asks for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund or other source, and we'd have to evaluate priority. But yeah, we don't have a money tree.
No, I would say that if there were enough pressure put on the state, it could be that the state of Illinois could make a special trial grant for X dollars that could be used, say $10 million grant that could be used to do 4 projects that are housing co-ops. I'm just using it as an example. That might be more likely.
So I think we were under the understanding that the maneuvers that State Senator Simmons achieved in Springfield would unlock some of the trust fund dollars that could be prioritized for cooperatives.
I don't care what he put in. You still got to get the Ida board to approve using trust fund money for this versus, and I could give you a list of other, in my opinion, higher priority needs like permanent supportive housing or to name one.
Right.
So I wouldn't count on that.
So I just wanted to echo, I think that it was very encouraging what IDA did to remove any restrictions. Previously, it had to be a fee simple model, and you succeeded in changing that. That was terrific. And one of the issues about gap financing that we did see changed, but I don't think it's been utilized, is historically the low-income housing tax credit at the state, formerly known as the donation tax credit, was always tied with gap financing in rental deals.
Yeah.
But in the last session, it was expanded to be available in ownership deals. But I don't know that I've heard of anybody moving in. That's just a thought. I know it needs more, but it is one source that has been open to at least considered an ownership approach, whereas it was constrained by rental previously. And then I wonder if that's similar type of work that needs to happen, say, even at Federal Home Loan Bank with their AHP money. Is that something that can be explored and opened up? And, the list goes on. People have been talking about home. I know Andy mentioned the Minneapolis program, and what we've heard is it was really kind of constrained by that senior population and what needs to happen strategically slash in the public policy realm to expand and make that more accessible. With just some thoughts, but I see movement and the momentum is encouraging, and just delighted Ida's been so involved in helping to think through this. Andy, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think you're right. AHP, actually, the Federal Home Loan Bank program has home ownership, at least in some regions. And they provide sort of grants per unit, 15, 20,000 kinds of grants. But one of the things I'm hearing is that co-ops are being viewed as being sort of higher income people with less needs. Although we find in lots of places, if you're working with existing buildings, you're working with some of the lowest income renters, and you're talking about preserving some of the more affordable rental properties, often in neighborhoods that are seeing, gentrification and other sorts of things. So that in those cases, I would think it would be a priority. I mean, in our buildings, the folks who are sort of in the buildings historically, when they get converted for existing residents, their incomes are often way below 50% of median. And so that's why we need the Section 8 in order to be able to make sure that they can stay in their buildings. But it also, though, makes these projects apply both because we're preserving, the homes for people with lower incomes, but also we're preserving affordable rental properties in neighborhoods that are seeing gentrification. So that's more in the existing occupied building conversions. So that's the other way around that.
Peter? Yeah.
Yeah. King, you met the donation tax credit. Is that a refundable tax credit, or is that require investors like LIHTC?
I don't know. I'd have to look into that.
Because that's been an impediment, of course, with co-ops and LIHTC, is the ability to actually own the property, which is of course problematic when you're doing a housing co-op.
Yeah, well, I thought my understanding of the donation tax credit is it's not about the investor, owning any entity. They just get a dollar for dollar. They get a $50 for dollar, 50%, whatever they donate, whether it's cash, whether it's property, whatever. They get a tax credit equivalent to 50%. And so it doesn't work like the LIHTC. It does not.
No.
They're not an ownership structure. They're not an ownership position for that.
It has been fueled significantly by donation of land.
Yeah, it's primarily land that gets donated, and you value the land, and then that value comes into the project.
Yeah.
So it's something that if a co-op has donated property, donated rehab materials, that kind of thing, there could be possibly a way to generate some equity for a co-op in that space.
Yeah.
Andy, when you were talking about, I think you said, was it home? That was just on the share lending side, not on the capital?
On the capital side, we used to use them on the capital side to fill gaps in the rehab of buildings. And as I said, like vouchers, home rules allow for up to 80% of median for home ownership.
Yeah. Okay.
So the other thing I was going to say is one of the things Peter has been a champion of, although we haven't had a lot of time to do, is trying to get the low-income housing tax credit to be a direct pay tax credit. so that in fact co-ops could use it and then would get a payment every year for the tax credit. And I was reminded actually by my son who works at the energy department when I was complaining about tax credits and, and induction stoves and solar panels and stuff on our co-ops. I said, well, our folks can't use those tax credits. He said, no, the rural electric co-ops got those tax credits to be direct pay. So nonprofits, local governments, and co-ops can use the energy tax credits so that all those tax credits that are available for solar, for induction stoves, for wiring, heating systems, all those things that show up as tax credits. We used to just ignore tax credits for co-ops, but now they can be used because they have a direct pay option, something that we're trying to build momentum for on the low-income housing tax credit, because then they would work for co-ops and it would open up all the benefits that are available for low-income housing tax credits, but not to be ignored on the energy climate side.
Interesting. Okay, can you just for my clarification, just explain to me how that works, the direct pay, just tell me. How that.
Well, if if a LIHTC was direct pay, basically what happens with the energy tax credits, if a rural electric co-op has a wind farm, they've had the same problem that they couldn't own the wind farm. And so instead of finding an investor to buy those tax credits with the direct pay, the rural electric co-op is able to file a tax return each year and get a refund. So if they've got $1 million tax credit coming this year, they get $1 million check on that wind farm.
And then at the beginning of the project, they can look at that stream of income and they can borrow against it. It increases their income.
Yeah, on a practical level, that's how you build the project, is borrowing against that stream.
Right. And it is not as much as the investors might put in equity, or at least it's not. But on the other hand, you have neither the complications nor the expense of doing a low-income housing tax credit.
Because you lose the depreciation tax credit that the investor is getting in addition to the low-income housing tax credit. But as Andy says, taking out that complication and expense probably doesn't fully balance it. But of course, if we could get 80 cents on the tax credit dollar into a project instead of 100%, it would still be huge in a co-op project.
Okay, interesting.
So you should sign on to direct pay when we start trying to figure out how to do this lobbying. I won't say that, but
are new market tax credits just unwieldy for this type of project?
New markets tax credits can be used for home ownership. They're actually pretty good. If you've got somebody who can go through the brain damage to actually structure it, because one of the uses is for home ownership.
It is, yeah.
Creating home ownership, and the investors are done the day you've sold all the units.
Yeah.
And so